Um, Erik is a global finance professional with experience in the private and public sectors. In 2020, he was nominated to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Panama. Previously, he was nominated by the President and confirmed unanimously by the Senate to represent the United States in the World Bank. At the World Bank, Erik participated in the analysis and deployment of over $100 billion of capital in the developing world through grants, loans, equity investments, and other financial products. Earlier in his career, Erik worked as an investment banker and private equity professional focused on emerging markets. He was managing director at Franklin Templeton Investments, and he executed private equity transactions in Latin America. Prior to this, he was based in Shanghai as managing partner of SinoLatin Capital and managing director at ChinaVest. Earlier in his career, Erik held a variety of emerging markets-focused private equity and investment banking positions at JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley in both New York and Mexico City. Erik earned his bachelor's degree in economics and political science from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis and his MBA from Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He speaks Spanish, Portuguese, and Mandarin. All right, Erik, so here we go. So as we just heard, your background involves private equity and finance.
¿Hacemos la entrevista en español o en inglés?
En español no.
En español,
El
bueno.
Mickey Mouse español mío de Miami no puedo hacer eso. Back in 2009, you started SinoLatin Capital in Shanghai. And you've mentioned before that you were quite bullish about China's growing economic influence in Latin America. What do you think has changed from then to now? And as you look back, would you still have created SinoLatin Capital?
Wow, that's a great question. So when I moved to China in 2005, 2006, I think most people thought China was going to develop sort of like a big version of South Korea, just 10 times bigger, or like Japan. And unfortunately, it's turned in a very different direction. China politically has done a 180. And to me, what's very sad is that despite the fact that I have a fondness for the Chinese culture, the people, the food, the Chinese Communist Party has forever changed the dynamic in China. So I'll explain from my own personal experience. In 2006, 7, and 8, the Communist Party didn't really factor into a lot in society. Most Chinese people wanted to be the next Jack Ma. They wanted to be the next oligarch. They wanted to be the next, billionaires. Chinese companies were proliferating and starting. And what China had done for the previous 30 years was that it unlocked the power of the individual. Prior to that, the state, controlled everything under Chairman Mao. And then Deng Xiaoping allowed the power of the people to proliferate. What happened, though, was as more and more people began exercising power, it became a threat to the CCP and the Chinese Communist Party. Think of it as an empire, like the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty or the Yuan Dynasty, and you don't want to lose your power. And so when Xi Jinping came into office, he began extending the tentacles of the government into every aspect of society. And today, it's a very, very different place than it was. To the second part of your question, would I have done SinoLatin Capital knowing what I know today and where we are today? Perhaps not.
Yeah, 2020 hindsight, right? All right, so in your view, how have China's investments and trade policies impacted Latin America and the Caribbean? Are there particular sectors or countries where this impact has been most pronounced?
Yeah, so look, I'm not stating anything that any of you don't already know. China did not win the geological lottery. It's very difficult to find economically extractable sources of iron or copper or lithium or whatever. Arable land, renewable water supplies that aren't totally contaminated. So China went to Latin America for one reason, and it was, we need the materials to allow our economy to flourish. And the problem, there are a few problems with that. Number one is if you're a Latin American country and you have one customer, guess what? They can control the price. They can control your economy. They can, if they don't buy from you that year, they don't, right? If they do buy from you, they do. I'll give you a case in point. in 2010 or 11, Christina Kirchner decided to basically get very aggressive with China on trade policy. And the Chinese said, well, we're not going to buy any more Argentine soy oil, because Argentina can only sell oil to China, not the beans themselves. Guess what? It took a month of China not buying the soy oil for her to go, oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, China. I'm so sorry. And then like everything happened again. So if you have one customer and your customer has all the leverage over you, that's a problem, right? The second issue is this. You sell your copper or your minerals to China, and then it comes back as a finished product. Well, what that does is it hollows out your manufacturing sector. So if you're a shoemaker, by the way, your shoes are amazing, I have to say. But if you are a shoemaker in Brazil, how do you compete with China? It's impossible. So if you are a manufacturer of whatever, it's impossible to compete. Umbrellas, textiles, or something. So you've hollowed out the middle class, and you've given China control over your economy, right? So now, what's been happening lately is China has moved from buying iron ore to buying and building electricity generating facilities, to building dams. It's gone to purchasing the electricity distribution of certain countries, cell phone equipment. And now you're in a situation where China has moved up the value curve, and it, in effect, can control the decisions of many countries. So if you're a country in Latin America and you want your own autonomy, you're in a lot of trouble.
So just to follow up on that, you made a good point about the autonomy, sovereignty, essentially, when it comes to these countries. As you know, there was a recent election in Panama. You were nominated to be ambassador in Panama. How do you think the relationship's going to change now under Molino between China and Panama?
Look, I can't say. It's a new candidate, and it's unclear what the direction Panama will go. But rather, perhaps than focus on China and Panama, I think what we can do is think about how can the United States be more effective in Panama? How can we work with Panama to create an enabling environment? The FATF gray list. Let's get Panama off of that. Let's bring in U.S. commercial banks to operate in China, many of them. Let's bring in the industrial might of the United States, technology. There's so many ways in which the United States and Panama can form a stronger relationship. Panama and the U.S. already have a very strong relationship, culturally and otherwise. And I think what we need to do is we need to work with the Panamanians to create a very pro-Western, pro-democratic society that benefits both the Panamanians and also the U.S. Now, what's happened in Panama in the past, we've got to figure out what to do with it. As many of you know, China controls terminals on both sides of the canal. They're building the so-called fourth bridge, they're going to undoubtedly have equipment to look and see what's going underneath it. The telecommunication systems have Huawei and ZTE. The ports have Chinese scanning equipments and Chinese cranes. These are all things that are very concerning. So we need to be aware of that. But as to the new administration, I don't know. Let's wait and see.
Right. Well, water crisis is another one. I think that the U.S. can probably provide some assistance in figuring out what they can do related to the canal, but that's a challenging one. Going back to the other point there, it's interesting, right? You have the Panama Canal Treaty, but if you own all the critical infrastructure of the canal, by default, you have some level of control and access to it. So it's definitely a
absolutely
sovereignty for the Panamanians.
Well, and 40% of grain traverses the canal. If our military ships, American military ships, need to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific or vice versa, and Panama, the two sides of the canal have Chinese container operators, that's obviously a national security issue.
Right.
But what's worse is if the Panama Canal gets blocked, and you have to go underneath South America, it might not surprise anyone that China is building a port in Ushuaia and the southern part of South America to be able to again create a dangerous situation for U.S. vessels. So we need to be very aware of what's going on.
Yeah, with the canal, some of the counter arguments with that is, well, China needs the canal too. But we've seen over many years now, starting with Nicaragua, but they're looking for other options, whether they're dry canals or other options to move their goods and their needs. So I think it would definitely impact the U.S. more, and it just makes that partnership even more important.
Wait till the port of Shanghai in Peru gets connected to Brazil. That's going to be a big wake-up call for all of us. If you're not tracking that, it is a big deal. So just Google el puerto de Shanghai and puede ser bastante peligroso para Estados Unidos. Anyway.
All right, so moving on, let's talk some about the World Bank here. You served as a representative to the World Bank and spearheaded several technology initiatives such as AI, blockchain, and the tokenization of World Bank loans. What countries or regions did you see most effectively leverage such technology to boost their security? And what recommendations would you have for other Latin American countries?
Right. So let me provide a little bit of context. The World Bank sits on petabytes of data, like an incredible amount of data going back 50, 60 years, okay? A lot of it is unstructured data. And this is data on everything: economic growth, infant mortality, soybean production, anything you can think of. And the World Bank is sitting on this treasure trove of data. And my position was to say, why don't we let AI, I'm going back 4 years, right? Why don't we let artificial intelligence ingest all of that data, and then what do we do with it? Let's let the data inform decisions. So for example, if infant nutrition programs led to higher test scores 5 years later for the kids, maybe there's something to it, right? So the point was, how do we make future decisions leveraging what's worked in the past? That was my idea. Now, insofar as what can Latin American countries do, every Latin American country has the same thing. You're in your Ministry of Commerce, your Treasury, your state ministries. You have all of this information. How can you harness the power of technology to be able to make good decisions for your people? And there are, whether it's OpenAI or whether it's Google or whether it's a plethora of new artificial intelligence companies, you can effectively do the same thing and make, hopefully, good decisions for your people.
Did you make any progress with those programs where you're still there?
I did. I think that there was a bit of hesitancy on the part of the bank to do new things. And it's a very large organization, as you can imagine. Between consultants and full-time employees, it's like 30,000 people in over 150 offices around the world, deploying $100 billion a year. So moving a giant ship, is very difficult.
Right. Yeah. So as you know, the Biden administration is America's partnership for economic prosperity, has a key focus on digital workforce development, supply chain resilience. Costa Rica and Panama are two key countries in advanced semiconductor packaging and testing. What other lessons can you extract from that and export to other Latin American countries as a model from what Costa Rica and Panama have been successful doing?
So the high level here is that the map of the supply chain is getting reconfigured, okay? What used to almost exclusively be produced in China is now becoming a concern. And I can probably assure you that at every corporate boardroom in America, quietly they're saying, hey, geopolitical risk, what do we do? What if something happens in China? Where do we move? The biggest beneficiary to that movement of the supply chain is Latin America, at least for the United States, right? And so there's going to be a quiet but growing exodus of companies, multinational companies leaving China and going to maquiladoras in Mexico or wherever, right? And quietly moving out. And whether it's packaging for semiconductors or whether it's building anything, right? I think this is the best. The next 10 years are going to be golden years for Latin America particularly for those countries that create enabling environments, whether it's through taxes, energy policies, visas, pro-business. If you want business to come to your country, it will come because it's leaving China. If you look at the map of container shipping, it's decelerating massively in places like Dalian and other places, and it's moving to Mexico, Lázaro, wherever. It's moving to Santos. So you're seeing massive upticks, if you want to use that as a measurement. So that's only going to continue, and Latin America stands to benefit greatly.
Well, just keeping on the same vein of the World Bank, it's often criticized for not being quick enough to meet the needs of global South countries. For instance, Caribbean and small island developing states often say that they can't get concessional loans from the World Bank because of the arbitrary designation of high-income country status. On day one, that was also brought up during one of the panels. Since you served the World Bank, what are some of the reforms the World Bank needs to make to respond to the developing world more readily?
Okay, so let me sort of dumb it down to a degree. Concessional loans, like a lot of people don't understand this. So the World Bank has a group that provides grants. Grants means like free money to poor countries, right? And once you move beyond a certain GDP per capita, then you get into another program. The first program is called IDA, the next one's called IBRD, but forget the acronyms, right? If you're like a super poor country, you get free money. The next countries up, you get cheap loans. And then you get to a certain point where you graduate, right? The problem is there's a misalignment of incentives. If you're a poor country getting free money, well, you don't want to graduate to get to the next level because you don't get free money anymore. And then if you have like super cheap loans, you don't want to graduate from the, so there's a like a misalignment of incentives, let's just say. Now, the other issue that we face is if your GDP per capita is too high, the World Bank says, thank you, see you later, good luck in life. In the Caribbean, however, it just takes, you're one hurricane away from being a desperately poor country, right? So a hurricane comes through whatever, pick a country, St. Lucia, right? And all of a sudden, you went from a GDP per capita of this to here. So the World Bank needs
to— Or a pandemic.
Right. Absolutely. If your country relies on tourism, as every country in the Caribbean does, and people don't visit you, you go broke, right? So the World Bank needs to create a mechanism to help countries deal with these types of exogenous factors that could affect them.
Perfect. So we have just over 4 minutes left. So I'm going to pause. I have one more question for you, but before I do, if anyone has in the audience a question for Erik, start making your way to one of the microphones on either side of the room when I ask this last question. Go ahead. All right, so last question. Looking forward, what trends do you foresee in the relationship between China and Latin American and Caribbean countries? Are there emerging sectors, initiatives that might define the next decade of the relationship, especially regarding security issues and security stability?
Wow. How much time do we have?
3.5 minutes.
Okay. So let's talk about the relationship between China and Latin America and things that people aren't really thinking about. Let's talk about dumping and electric vehicles. That's a big deal these days. You may have noticed that the Biden administration is looking to quadruple tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. So what's happening in Mexico is the biggest investor in northern Mexico right now, the biggest by far, is China. So to skirt the anti-dumping rules that you have in the US, China is basically like sending everything to Mexico, assembling it there, and then getting it to the US through NAFTA. So that's something for all of us to be aware of. From a security, so that's from a business standpoint, things that you may or may not be thinking about. From a national security perspective, let's begin north to south. 10,000 military-age Chinese males crossing across our border like every month. I don't know if you guys are tracking this, but when did that happen, right? I can understand women and children with babies, crossing the border because of war or they're refugees, but military-age Chinese males, why, right? So that's an issue. The ports in South America, cranes, the port cranes, all of which have back doors. Transformers, 80%, well, in the United States, 70% of our large transformers are Chinese. And if somebody wanted to shut our electricity grid, that could be done very easily. Imagine if you're a Latin American country and the Three Gorges Corporation owns, you know, like 5 of your electricity plants. Isn't that a security threat? The cyber threat. I mean, the list goes on. And then finally, economic coercion through Belt and Road loans. You take money from China, and then you can't pay China back. Well, okay, fine, give me a port. I mean, we've seen that play out in Djibouti. We've seen it play out in Sri Lanka. We've seen it play out certainly in Africa. So if you're a policymaker in Latin America and you're like signing the loan document, make sure you read it, because you know there's a lot of collateral on the other side.
Back in the energy piece in itself, I think isn't Chile 50%, over 50% of their energy grid is owned by a Chinese company, by one of the state-owned enterprises?
You got it.
Yes, it's a risk. Okay, I wish we had more time to discuss kind of the free market system and the risks associated with PRC and that, but we don't. So I think that we had a question from someone in the audience. Go ahead.
Sí, muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Juan Flores. Represento a la Fundación 15 de Septiembre, una organización promigrante hondureña. Hemos estado observando ayer y hoy este tema de China y nos ha llamado mucho la atención, por ejemplo, en Honduras, que se está instalando China. Incluso la presidenta de Honduras, Xiomara Castro, visitó inmediatamente, después de tomar posición ella, visitó China, y el presidente de China alaba esta gestión porque era como una promesa de campaña de la presidenta. Y esto nos llama la atención porque vemos que al instalarse China, pues lo primero que se hizo fue desembarcarse de Taiwán, y nos deja prácticamente a nosotros como hondureños, la empresa privada que enviaba camarón, enviaba café y melón, a cerrar estas empresas porque se cierran estos convenios. Entonces nosotros consideramos que al instalarse China, y no sé si me podrían contestar a la pregunta, se considera que esta alianza de China con Honduras, siendo que Honduras es un aliado estratégico para Estados Unidos por su base militar y por la cercanía, se considera que China con Honduras se podría ya convertir en una amenaza para la seguridad nacional de los Estados Unidos, porque lo que hemos estado escuchando, que al acercarse China a estos países, más bien genera pobreza, porque no hay desarrollo para las poblaciones, y terminan estas migraciones masivas como lo que estamos viendo en la frontera, donde este primer trimestre el Instituto de Migración de México dice que hay 40,000 hondureños esperando entrar, 90,000 venezolanos, pero si comparamos la masa poblacional de Venezuela con Honduras, podemos ver de que tenemos una gran crisis. Eso es lo que quería decir.
Bueno, en mi opinión, yo creo que sí. Lo que pasa no solo con Honduras, sino con cualquier país latinoamericano que deja que los chinos entren. ¿Qué pasa con la industria? Antes uno producía, qué sé yo, muebles o zapatos o textiles, y uno no puede comparar el sector laboral en Honduras con el chino. O sea, las importaciones chinas siempre van a ser mucho más baratas. Entonces, ¿qué pasa? Los hondureños se quedan sin trabajo y tienen que emigrar. Y eso puede ser una amenaza para Estados Unidos. No una amenaza. Puede ser problemático para Estados Unidos tener que absorber de mucha gente, ¿no? Con respecto a, bueno, mira, otros aspectos de seguridad nacional no les sé decir, porque no conozco tan bien Honduras como otros países, pero mi opinión es que si uno empieza a aliarse con China, eventualmente termina como, o sea, títere de ellos, ¿no? Y no sé cómo va a terminar. Y no tengo opinión sobre la nueva presidenta, pero lo que sí sé es que durante la época de COVID, los hondureños no estaban recibiendo vacunas y los chinos están amenazando a Honduras diciendo, pues, si paran de reconocer a Taiwán y reconocen a nuestro país, vamos a poder ayudar a que los hondureños reciban vacunas de nosotros y de otros países.
Okay. we're out of time. We're a little over, but I just want to say thanks, Erik.
Yeah, sure.
Please join me in a round of applause for Erik.